coming out this afternoon. I'm Carol Doherty. I'm the director of the Newhouse Center for Humanities, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to an afternoon that we're calling really creatively Everybody's Critic. Given the decline in print journalism and the rise of electronic media, a trend that gives all of us with access to a smartphone, which reminds me all of you with smartphones and other size phones, dumb phones, medium phones, don't forget to turn them off. All of us have the opportunity now to review anything from our latest Amazon purchase to a movie, theatrical performance, a meal. The role of the critic is now once again under review. It's not a new debate, of course, but just a quick look online reveals a flurry of recent online debates and blogs devoted to the future of criticism, suggesting that the topic has once again gained a sense of urgency and is now inflected in new ways. Some lament the lack of professional credentials of the amateur reviewer, while others, like Roger Ebert, famous for his thumbs up and thumbs down movie reviews, he celebrates a new golden age of criticism, saying, what the internet is creating is a class of literate, gifted amateur writers in an old tradition. Like Trollope, who was a British Post official all his working life, they write for love and because they must. Others are thinking about the relationship of reviewer to critic and of critic to artist. As part of a recent online New York Times debate about the state of criticism, Jeremy Barker of CultureBot distinguishes between the job of the reviewer, which he characterizes as essentially dispensing consumer advice, and the more thoughtful work of the critic. He argues, quote, it's essential that critics leave behind the role of arbiter of taste or hitmaker, and instead serve as engaged, accessible writers whose work helps audiences navigate the intersection of art, culture, politics, and economics. Through CultureBot, in fact, Barker has proposed a new framework for arts criticism that he refers to as critical horizontalism, arguing that criticism is itself a creative practice in which the writer's response is the continuation of a dialogue initiated by the artist. So clearly the roles of reviewer, critic, artist, as well as terms like professional and amateur, are all being revisited and renegotiated in light of the internet and other changes in the practice of art and in technologies of communication. So this afternoon, we have gathered here 3 critics, some professional, some with other day jobs, whose areas of expertise include performance, art, and literature. We'll talk about the role of the critic as they practice it today. Claudia La Rocco is the founder and artistic director of the performanceclub.org, which won a 2011 Arts Writers Grant. She writes about performance for the New York Times and is on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts graduate program in arts criticism and writing. Sebastian Smee is the art critic for the Boston Globe and winner of the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for criticism. He joined the Globe's paper staff from Sydney, where he worked as national art critic for the Australian. And James Wallenstein is the Newhouse visiting creative writing professor here at Wellesley. He's also the author of a novel, The Arriviste, which came out in 2011, and writes essays and stories that have appeared in GQ, the Antioch Review, Boston Review, and Hudson Reviews. So here's the plan for this afternoon. I've asked each of our critics to open with a piece of criticism of their own, one that hopefully will open up provocative questions that we can then use as a basis for discussion, which we will then open up to the audience. So Claudia is going to go first.
Critical horizontalism. Sounds like a medical condition. I think I'm getting some. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out. So I thought that I would just read 2 things. The first is a piece that I wrote for the New York Times in 2010, October 15th, 2 years ago. And these reviews are, rapid fire. You see a show, your copy's due in at 11 a.m. the next day. So really not much time for processing anything. You have to go with your gut and live with your mistakes. And then after that, I'm going to just read the first couple of sections of a poem that I wrote that cannibalizes this review and other things, and sort of just steals mostly from myself, but also from some artists with credit. I'll start with the dance review. I suppose you could call Rolf Lemon an interdisciplinary artist, but somehow the term seems flat and cumbersome in describing his output, which at this point feels more like a continuing set of questions and proposals than a series of distinct pieces. He is building a body of work in the truest sense, reaching for a poetics at once complex and simple, and constructing a container to receive, if only for scattered moments, things that can't be kept. For those familiar with his performances in visual art, the New York premiere of How Can You Stay in the House All Day and Not Go Anywhere on Wednesday at the Brooklyn Academy of Music was replete with intimate resonances. For those not, Mr. Lemon began the evening with a primer of sorts. Sunshine Room, a film surveying some of his key themes and collaborators and looking back at his large stage production Come Home Charlie Patton from 2004. Mr. Lemon tucked his thin, supple body into a white chair on stage, just in front of a large screen, a thin sheaf of papers on his lap and a microphone before him. It was as if he were settling down for story time. Chief among his collaborators in recent years has been Walter Carter, a former sharecropper born in 1908. And there Mr. Carter was, on the screen, on his Mississippi property, clambering into a homespun space that looked as if it wouldn't get him to the market, much less the moon. Life, art, and artifice, all improbably tangled up. This is Walter, my teacher, a recording of Mr. Lemon's voice informed us. This is one of my lessons. With Mr. Carter, who died this year, Mr. Lemon built a layered world of fable, political archetypes, and the everyday. The older man seemed at times to serve as the artist's avatar, helping Mr. Lemon get at things that were too much for him to touch on his own. In Sunshine Room, one of these is the demise of Asako Takami, Mr. Lemon's partner, who died in 2007 after a long illness. How Can You Stay is dedicated to her and Mr. Carter, as well as to Morse Cunningham and Pina Bausch. The losses stack up and up and up. After 3.5 years of denying it could ever happen, it took Asako only 18 hours to disappear, Mr. Lemon told us. She is never in the film. Instead, there are Mr. Carter and his wife Edna, reenacting scenes from the original Solaris, the Tarkovsky science fiction movie in which a man is visited by his dead wife in outer space. They are at once themselves, the film characters, Mr. Lemon and Miss Takami, and none of the above. The quiet, meditative elegy of this first section gave way to part 2, Wall/Hole, a go-for-broke dance performed by Mr. Lemon's 6 enthralling performers who helped create the material. It picks up on the end movement of Charlie Patton. Dressed in colorful slacks and shirts, the dancers hurled themselves through space, legs buckling, joints smacking the floor, torsos unfurling like ribbons in the wind. They seemed boneless at times, their bodies collapsing into dense scrums, then scattering. It was painful to watch, sometimes exhilarating, sometimes only wearying. A physical overdose coming hard on the heels of a delicate grappling with grief, love, and theater. Okui Akpakwasili, the performer perhaps most associated with Mr. Lemon, whipped herself in circles with one arm flung out, seemingly in an ecstatic trance. Later, after the stage had cleared of its chaotic bodies and the audience sat in semi-darkness, her wailing cries filled the theater. I hope it doesn't sound as weird out there as it's... She eventually edged onto the stage, her bare back to us, shuddering and heaving, and finally, just before exiting again, almost casually picking up a tambourine. Given Mr. Lemon's exploration of racial stereotypes and expectations, it was hard not to think of Black American artists who have performed facing away from the audience, refusing the role of entertainer, even as they entertained. Another potent and fraught figure often conjured by Mr. Lemon, Brer Rabbit, reappeared in a video designed by Jim Finley. He was surrounded by a gathering of animals, rendered in ghostly white outlines, which ambled onto the dark backdrop. The audience stared at them. They stared back. I thought of 2 lines from Sunshine Room, which came after Mr. Carter had asked the hare the question for which the overall work is titled. Quote, "The hare stares blankly.
The question is, of course, the answer and the form in which the answer exists. Mr. Lemon asks so many questions in so many forms. His answers at some level always seem to contain a yes. And this was the last word he uttered on stage on Wednesday, after he and Miss Oppoquasili had cycled through No Room, a subdued duet that read like an echo of the earlier kinetic free-for-all. Mr. Lemon said it as a matter of fact, an answer that was also another question. Yes, what else could he have said? Life and art go on until they don't. So that's the review. So I've been writing essentially my whole life, and writing for me is my art form, and poetry is where I started. But my sort of anchor in criticism is with the idea of it as a literary art form, and the poet-critic tradition is the one to which I aspire. And I think for the first few years when I was writing criticism, I had this idea that I had a day job, that's what paid the bills, and that I, wrote poetry in my off hours, and that was sort of, the thing that would never pay the bills, and so therefore some separation of church and state. And then a few years ago, I just thought, well, that's bollocks, and it's the same thing. It's just trying to make something good with words, and trying to understand the world and to engage with other parts of the world. And so that just opened up a whole bunch of other spaces for me in my head and in my writing, and led to things like this, which is a long poem. I'll only read the first few sections. And it was published in Hyperallergic, which is a visual art blog, and it was published as an editorial statement for a statement about criticism and art. This is They Always Ask for Water. 1. Today was unseasonably warm. There were mountains in the distance, and disaster was coming. I heard it on the evening news. Dear lover, I keep losing my nerve. Just after 1 week, it starts already to tilt. You told me the demands of security maybe only secure the substitute. Also that the soul is left behind when we fly. But who said these things first? Already sometimes I think it is ruined between us. There is a whole pack of squid in the freezer. I will eat them all tonight. I will watch hunting videos and read old German poetry which no one understands. Watch TV, sit on the couch, can't say much with a dick in your mouth. We obsess over things because they aren't true. There are things to see and things to hear, and sometimes you fool yourself that you're paying attention to the right things. Mr. Lemon tucks his thin, supple body into a white chair on stage, just in front of a large screen, a thin sheaf of papers on his lap, and a microphone before him. There are fires on the horizon. Just tell me I'm good. So actually, maybe I'll stop there with a quote that I stole directly from myself, and because the New York Times is what it is, I actually am stealing from the paper because it's not my copyright. But one of the things that I really liked about doing stuff like that, and because it's poetry, they're not paying attention, so it's great, is that it's reappropriating something that had an incredibly specific context, and hopefully giving it a new life, but also extending the life of that old thing. So when I read this, or when people read it who understand the world that I write about professionally, there are all of these layers of understanding and access that they have. So extending and shifting the context is a lot of fun for me, and also to me seems very much a critical act. So I wouldn't, I would say these two things function the same way, or they aspire to function the same way. So I think that's my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Claudia does it. It's amazing. I mean, the pressure of I'm going to say that was the most amazing part. No, but I mean, just in terms of seeing these dance performances, so many of them, incredibly thought-provoking and evocative, and then having to describe them, and then conjure ideas and put a coherent piece together like that beautiful piece on such a pressurized deadline. To me, it's amazing, and I feel in a relatively luxurious position of going to see shows at museums, and often having a lot more time, almost always having a lot more time to write about them and think about them and read the catalog. I mean, I rarely read the catalog in its entirety. That would be too much, but I do think it's a luxury. And one of the other things that I get to do is walk around the museum in which the show is. Often I travel around New England, and if I do, say, go to Portland Museum or out to the Berkshires to Massimoka or to Smith College, and here in Wellesley at the wonderful Davis Museum, which is such a terrific museum that you guys have here. I always make sure that I take the time out to wander around the museum. And one of the things I do is then choose a work of art. I sort of inaugurated this column at the Globe, where every 2 weeks I write about one specific work of art that's permanently on display. Because I think that in this sort of focus on temporary shows, which are very exciting, we often forget what sort of riches there are, just permanently on display in many wonderful museums around this part of the world. So I try to make sure, as I say, to make time to pick out works of art that I love, and I write this column every 2 weeks. And so I thought it'd be fun just to read one of those columns. The column's called Frame by Frame. And I think I must have been in a particularly self-reflective mode about criticism when I chose this painting, which is by a woman called Florine Stettheim. So I'll just read it out and then pass it back on to Jimmy. So this was a work that hangs, by the way, in Smith College Museum of Art. Robert Hughes once compared being an art critic to, quote, being the piano player in a whorehouse. You don't have any control over the action going on upstairs. While there are plenty of other, even less flattering descriptions of art critics going around, most of them coined, and fair enough, by artists, I think Hughes's has always been my favorite. My favorite visual description of an art critic is rather more generous, but it captures some of the deep-set oddity of the role. It's this portrait, and I wish I had a reproduction, but I don't. It's this portrait by Florine Stettheim, a painter and society hostess who lived in Europe for much of her youth. It depicts Stettheim's friend, the art critic Henry McBride, and it hangs in the Smith College Museum of Art. Art critics are frequently as perplexed by new art as the rest of the public. When McBride first saw work by Henri Matisse, for instance, he didn't know whether to take it, quote, as a joke or as a serious attempt at something beautiful. But he came around and eventually befriended Matisse and wrote an appreciative book about him. It's worth keeping this in mind because when Stettheim first showed her work in 1916, nothing sold and the reviews were pretty discouraging. She never showed her work publicly again. She nevertheless was one of the most interesting figures in American modernism. During her time in Europe, she encountered the likes of Gustav Klimt, Ferdinand Hörler, and Franz von Stuck, and she was an ardent fan of the Ballet Russe. Upon returning to America, she established herself at the center of a circle that included Marcel Duchamp, Marsden Hartley, Man Ray, and Alfred Stieglitz. It was to these intimates that she showed the work she continued to make in private. Her pictures were eccentric and frankly decorative, marked by boldly conceived designs, looping lines that convey a folksy decadence, and all kinds of fidgety, humorous details. Her colors were high-key, leaning toward the red and yellow end of the spectrum, and she liked to play with drastic contrasts and scale, inserting miniature details into flattened, often monumentalized compositions. Here, McBride, who was, by the way, a terrific critic, is shown seated on an odd triple-decker rocking chair against a tile floor that has been converted whimsically to tennis courts. Through a window, we see a backdrop of leaning palms, skyscrapers, a rainbow, and the sun. McBride's outline creates an impression of effete connoisseurship, and his black coat, black pants, and sockless shoes suggest the rarefied world of the fashion-conscious dandy. He's holding a scorecard and pencil. He was a big sports fan, apparently, but Stettheim may also be alluding to his role as a judge of art. And all around him are witty allusions to literature, art, and McBride's various other interests. Stettheim's salon, a modern version of the great 18th century salons run by French women, encouraged an atmosphere of intimacy and wit that its members obviously cherished. I can't imagine McBride being anything other than pleased with the result of this particular exchange. When Stedheimer's sister Etty gave this picture to Smith College, she wrote, "I also asked Henry McBee whether he thought he would be happy among your hundreds of young ladies, and he thought he would. So I'm very glad to present him to you." Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Because of the reactions here, yeah, I feel like the speaker's a really big, menacing guy behind me. Keep looking over my shoulder. Just to state the obvious, a dance critic or an art critic, you're okay. There's no first. If you're
Ignore it.
okay, yeah. Okay, if you're dance critics and art critics are responding to visual arts, obviously, a literary critic has got the words right there in front of him, and he can say, look, even if, and the words may be ambiguous, but they're words that he's speaking about in words. So it's in theory anyway, a lot easier. So I'm just going to read a review of a long short story, not even that long. I talk about the length in the piece, but a story that was published by itself, a Joseph Roth short story that's sort of been rediscovered. I thought it might be interesting because I tell pretty much the whole story in reviews, so you get to hear a story, kind of, or a summary of the story anyway. Okay, so the story is called the Leviathan, same as the Hobbes tract, but this is just a short story Joseph Roth wrote near the end of his life. Here goes. A book that contains a single short story carries a particular promise and a risk. The story, we think on picking it up, had better be good. These expectations are only heightened when the title of the lone story seems to comment on the slenderness of its presentation. Joseph Roth's The Leviathan weighs in at 46 pages, slighter than a single claw of the behemoth who in the book of Job makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. And if comparing a book to a beast seems inapt, how about comparing one book to another? Roth's Leviathan is almost as monumentally dwarfed by its other namesake, Thomas Hobbes' 700-page reflection on the state as the monster whose protection we cannot do without. Yet when Roth's Leviathan was first published in 1945, a decade after it was written, it was as a standalone book. This seems curious, given that the story is too short to be considered even a novella. The new edition merely follows this precedent, a sound one, it turns out. Novelistic in scope, the Leviathan is rich, artful, and mysterious. Its 46 pages might be counted as 92. Like Job, one of its antecedents, which Roth retold the book of Job in a novel called The Story of a Simple Man, which I kind of wondered might have been the inspiration for the Coen Brothers movie that apparently I'm the only one who liked, made about 3 years ago, called A Serious Man. Thank you. So I recommend it, but no one else does. Anyway, I'm going to start that sentence again, skip over the parenthetical part, and then it's a very short sentence. Leviathan is rich, artful, and mysterious. No, I read that sentence. It's 46, right out. Okay, maybe it's just, here we go. Okay. It should be read twice. Once to follow its fabulous stream of events, and again to begin to take stock of their meaning. Maybe that sentence should be read 3 times. The narrative moves fast, and although it is focused on the fortunes of a single character, these are shaped by the same grand themes that animate the more fully drawn episodes of the Radetzky March, the novel that made Roth's reputation in his lifetime, and on which it rests today. The Radetzky March figures the decline of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and that of the Trotov family, which serves the empire across 3 generations. The grandfather, a decorated soldier, the son, a government official, the grandson, an army officer who dies childless in the First World War. The end of the line for the Trotas signals the end for the Habsburgs as well. The protagonist of the Leviathan, a Jewish coral merchant living in a a small town in the Ukrainian region of Volhynia, Volhynia, part of Greater Russia instead of Austria-Hungary, has nothing in common with the Tratas. But Roth's treatment of the merchant is similar. He succeeds in describing through him an analogous, albeit much less detailed, historical trajectory to the one described across generations in Radetzky March. So it's a really big short story. It's like a novel, but it's 45 pages. When we meet the merchant, he lives in a state of simple righteousness. He has never left his hometown and never missed his prayers. These devotions complement others that, taken together, are the pillars of his virtue. Devotion to his business, his merchandise, his staff, the women who string the beads he has lovingly sorted, sing as they work, and to his customers, to whom he opens his home and offers hospitality. In the small town of Progrody, the story begins, there lived a coral merchant who was known far and wide for his honesty and the reliability and quality of his wares. The farmers' wives came to him from far distant villages when they needed an ornament for some festive occasion. There were other coral merchants who were closer at hand, but he knew that from them they would only get cheap stuff and no good tat. And so, in their rickety little carts, they traveled many versts to Progrody and the renowned coral merchant, Nisan Pishenik. But Pishenik loves his merchandise too well. With his red hair and copper-colored goatee, his affinity for it seems too deep not to be idolatrous. Against the mistaken science of his day, he believes that corals aren't plants at all, but living creatures, a kind of tiny reddish sea animal that remained alive even when they had been sawn, cut, polished, sorted, and threaded. He harbors a secret longing for the sea, the underworld where his beloved corals are formed. His attempts to indulge this longing are Pishenik's undoing. He accompanies a furloughed Russian sailor by train to his battleship in Odessa, receives a special tour of the ship, and idles away weeks at the port, neglecting both his prayers and his worldly affairs and giving himself over to dissipation. He returns home to discover that his trade is faltering. A new coral merchant has set up shop nearby, offering brighter, apparently superior beads for prices so far below Pishenik's that his former customers suspect him of having cheated them. Pishenik visits the new shop. His rival is a devil whose beads aren't real coral at all, but celluloid imitations. The rival merchant offers Pishenik a stock of the fake beads. Pishenik resists temptation, then succumbs to it, mixing the fake beads with real ones. But his new tawdry offerings fail to win back customers. His reputation is lost, and his pride is shattered. He burns the celluloid beads, packs the real ones, and decides to emigrate, boarding a ship for Canada. But the ship sinks, and Pishenik goes down with it. The narrator declines to comment on Pishenik's demise, leaving us to decide what to make of it. We may be tempted to conclude that Pishenik has it coming, that he reaps his just reward for worshipping a false god. But Roth presents Pishenik's theology as a mild, unsubversive sort of Jewish deism. Now I'm quoting. I'm quoting now. Now the ancient God Jehovah had created everything, the earth and the beasts who walked upon it, the sea and all its creatures. But for the time being, namely until the coming of the Messiah, he had left the supervision of all the animals and plants of the sea, and in particular of corals, to the care of the Leviathan, who lay curled on the seabed. That's the end of the quotation. Or the Leviathan may look to us like a cautionary tale about the peril to traditional provincial folk of entering the modern world. After all, it is trains, ships, and plastics that lead to Pishenik's undoing. But since the shipment of coral to an inland village like Progrody would have depended on the establishment of a modern system of commerce, it would be a mistake to see Pishenik as that system's victim. He partakes of it from the outset. Nor does it seem likely that Roth would knowingly produce such a tale when he was no traditionalist at all, but a cosmopolitan committed to an imperial ideal in which sectarian differences are overcome by identification with and service to the state. But the conditions under which Roth was working in mid-1930s Europe must have made that ideal seem positively quaint. It was only a matter of time before the Leviathan, the collective entity formed as a stay against brutality, would turn brutality itself into a mass art, and few saw it coming more clearly than Roth himself. This is from the story again. As for the celluloid corals, Pishenik placed them on the copper tray of the samovar, and he set fire to them and watched them burning with a blue flame and a terrible stench. It took a long time. There were more than 15 pud of fake corals. Pud, I guess it's pud, yeah. 15 pud of fake corals. Indeed, all that was left of the celluloid was a gigantic heap of gray-black scrolled ashes and a cloud of blue-gray smoke twisting around the oil lamp in the middle of the room. This was Nisan Pishenik's farewell to his home. Perhaps the Leviathan should be seen as Roth's farewell to the continent whose flames would have consumed him had he lived long enough to reach, for them to reach him. He died in 1939 at the age of 44. The extent to which he chose to drink himself to death is uncertain. Sometimes his death is accounted as suicide, sometimes not. Either way, flight doesn't seem to have been an option. There are comparable suggestions of choice and redemption in the description of our hero's end. More than 200 passengers went down with the Phoenix. They were drowned, of course. But as far as Nishin Pishinik was concerned, who went down at the same time, one cannot simply say that he was drowned along with the others. It is truer to say that he went home to the corals, to the bottom of the ocean where the huge Leviathan lies coiled. Indeed, the very name Pishenik, with its echo of the Slavic root for the words for writer and scribe, Pismenik is writer in Ukrainian, for example, invites us to think of the hero as a stand-in for Roth, and so the Urset's corals that put Pishenik out of business as some sort of cheapened literary product. Perhaps the journalism and genre fiction that Roth was forced to turn out at such a manic rate. But we wouldn't want to take the comparison much further. To ascribe particular correspondences to the elements of the story would be to try to turn it into the kind of fable or parable that its representation of modern experience transcends. If it stands for anything, Pishenik's isolation stands for the vacuum in which his story seems to be told. The implied audience that infuses traditional moral tales with their immemorial hopefulness. A sense that one way or another life will go on, more or less as it has, is absent. The Leviathan issues from a world where fables and parables exist to transmit manners and customs toward one where the fundamental things, including the manner of transmission, would no longer apply. Oblivion alongside the Lord of the Depths must have seemed by comparison almost like a holiday on ice.
Before I forget, let me tell you that you can find links to all these reviews on our website. Just like from me, I'll refer you to our website and promise you that they're there. So if you want to be able to read at your leisure, you